Hello? A few days ago, I was reading an article in this magazine I go through once in a while called The Economist, which is a British sort of Financial Times article with a little bit of social commentary in there. And I ran across this piece in the October 4th edition titled "For Exchange and Embarrassment of Riches, Even the Most Sophisticated Arguments in Favor of a Wealth Tax Made No Sense." And since I was reading those books about, wealth and income and whatnot, I thought I'd comment on it and try to understand some of the more modern and political economic thinking around it, because I read one big book by Thomas Piketty. They mention him in here as quite a radical, so I thought I'd look at someone who, or at least a very short article which pushes against that. I, of course, am a total and complete amateur at this, but then again, you can find this magazine on occasion in the grocery store or in the airport or in a bookstore, right? This isn't exactly, how do I say, prime academic material you need a JSTOR account to access. This is something that the public reads, and I am a member of the public, so what do I think about it? It's a European article, and it's talking about France is in a giant fiscal hole. This year, the government will run a deficit of more than 5% of GDP. Though I guess as an American, I should not be laughing at that. It says, left-leaning economists and a growing number of centrist ones believe that a wealth tax is part of the answer. Gabriel Zuckman of the Paris School of Economics, for instance, has proposed an annual levy of 2%, and fortunes larger than 100 million. And then it says, although the arguments of economists today are subtler than those normally used to support levies on wealth, they are just as wrong-headed. So the writer of this article thinks that the arguments for a wealth tax, just a straight-up wealth tax, are bad. It says, a dozen OECD countries had wealth taxes in 1990, but Austria abolished theirs, Germany, Sweden, France. Only 3 rich countries, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland, still have a tax on net wealth. And as far as I know, these are very, very low taxes, like 0.03% or something like that. So the received wisdom, the general trend of taxation has been to abolish wealth taxes. Says politicians abandoned such taxes because they did not work. So a study found that wealth levies might raise little revenue and can operate unfairly and inefficiently. They face numerous problems. For example, valuing wealth and therefore the amount of taxes to take is supremely difficult. And I think this illustrates something quite interesting. That book that on Capital in the 21st Century was talking about this, and the book on taxation I read was talking about this. That part of the problem is, in order to tax people, you have to know how much wealth they have. So how rich exactly is Bill Gates, or how rich exactly is Elon Musk? And sometimes you run across articles and newspapers saying well, so-and-so is we think one of the richest people in the world, but their wealth is not publicly available for comment. Right? Like they own a lot of things, but it's very complicated corporate structure. Or they own private companies, and we don't really know exactly how much those are worth, as opposed to somebody like Elon Musk. A lot of his wealth is in companies publicly traded on the stock market. So if you know how much Tesla and SpaceX are worth, you know how much he owns of those, then you have a general idea of his wealth, sort of idea. And you have things like say you're a drug lord. Say you are involved in underground economies. Say that you are like part owner of 57 different companies doing different things and giving out different taxes. And some of them you are a direct owner, some of them you are like an owner through 4 different levels of corporate struggles. Some of them you own a foreign company. If you own a company in Russia, how accurate is that description? How accurate are the monies being reported? Perhaps you're involved in a tax haven somewhere, and the money doesn't go through the American economy at all. It's all in yen or yuan or pounds or something. It doesn't become an American dollar at any point. It doesn't touch the American banking system. But you're an American. How does the United States know what wealth you have? So it's much easier and simpler to tax the income reported, to tax a corporation on its payroll, for example, or its distributions to its stockholders and things like that. You have to know how much a person is worth, and that involves knowing a lot about them. That involves, in the case of people who avoid taxes, for example, this involves knowing about them. This involves looking at them, investigating them, auditing them, which requires effort. And as that book on the history of taxation showed, if you have to spend a lot of time and effort getting a tax, if you just try to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, and it's harder and harder all the time, and you're spending all this money to get money, and how effective is it? It's a big question. In the American political system, part of the activities that the Republicans did recently is that the Democrats had passed a budget to allow for more workers for the IRS, and the Republicans, upon getting in office in the House and Senate, cut that off. So the IRS doesn't need more people. The IRS does not need to investigate taxes more. The IRS does not need to try and squeeze the grape. You just accept what people pay you. Which, I mean, sure, that makes I get it. That makes sense in a way. If you lower taxes to not the expenditures you're getting, and don't simply pray for a miracle. But then I get into individual countries and whatnot. But this bit where it says wealth levies might raise little revenue, as far as we know, the general understanding is taxes and wealth don't raise a lot of revenue. They can be hard to use. People tend to leave the country if they're being taxed, their wealth is being taxed. You have instances where you may have heavy wealth taxation, but actually there are really big tax loopholes in that. We tax your wealth based on this and that, but if you make certain investments or for certain companies, we don't tax you, or we don't tax land, but we tax we don't tax land under development, but we do tax land used for residences. But we only tax the first. We're taxing the wealth tax, right? But we're only taxing the first 2 residences. You have interesting effects. For example, I know that New York City has a tax on its residents, and I watched a YouTube bit about this that I assume is mostly more or less true. That if you spend more than 150, you spend more than half the year in the city, then you count it as a resident, and so people might be very careful and not spend more than half the year in the city. Right? I only spent 135 days in the city, and I can prove it. So I'm actually a resident of New Jersey or something. I'm actually a resident of New Hampshire. And therefore, I should pay those taxes and not the tax that New York City has for me. And that might be the difference between a 12% tax and a 35% tax on whatever wealth or income. So you may have many rich people in your country or your state, but they might not live there. Might be their vacation spot. They might have vacation houses, and you're raising taxes on these houses, but how do you do that and not raise taxes on your local residents? And if you raise taxes too high on these vacation houses, then they may just fly off. Yeah, they can vacation somewhere else. Right? Raising revenue through wealth taxes is not always very effective. And so that book, The Capital in the 21st Century, I think it has a better point. It says that the point of wealth taxes is not to raise money. The point is to depress income disparity. Which I think is rather interesting. Right? That is, hey, let's say all the rich people leave and all that's left are poor people, but those poor people comprise a greater, all the poor people in an area are the ones who actually live there and are engaged in the issue. They don't have massive wealth from outside. So this is a more democratic instance. Right? We've all seen pictures of slums, and there's famous pictures of like Mexico or India where it shows very strictly and very, very harshly, here's the rich side of the city, here's the poor side of the city. You have a $4 or $5 million palace next to tin metal sheet shacks burning wood for warmth. And if all the palaces leave, you're only left with shacks. But part of the issue that can happen, of course, is the people who own the palaces also own all the political and economic power, right? And what effect does this have in the community? So I see the definite arguments that a wealth tax doesn't raise a lot of revenue and a wealth tax drives rich people away. And maybe that's the point, right? But this is a larger sociological claim. This is a political issue, and they make this a bit later, saying that economists shouldn't be getting involved in political issues; they should just be involved in economic issues. So that if you want to argue for a wealth tax as an economist, then you got to show that it is an effective tax. You have to show that it produces revenue. You have to show that it doesn't reduce the overall wealth of the community. And to claim that, hey, we may be poor, but we are freer, or we may be poor, but we are more democratic, is a political charge, a political claim. And there are possible reasons for that, right? It makes sense to say something like, it's bad for the economy, but good for the democracy, right? This is also dangerous, however, right? You can very easily say it's bad for the economy, but it's good for communism, right? It's good for the people. And this produces its own problem. So as a political movement, it suffers the problems of all political movements. It can go too far. How do you balance this out? And I think that as an economist, as someone who just summarizes the numbers and the taxes, you don't want to get involved in that situation. You don't want to be like, okay, how do we now you're doing political theory, right? Okay, how do we create our political system and link it to our economic system in such a way that we achieve political ends? Instead, it's about how do we access our economic system and use that to achieve economic ends. I think the point that the book Capital in the 21st Century does point out is that economists are going to look at the wealth of a country and say, hey, it's very rich. It has a lot of money, or the average wealth is going up. And you get into problems between the average wealth and the mean wealth, right? Average being, if we take everybody and put them on a scale, then the middle range of wealth is going to be here. But that is going to be absolutely modified by the super rich. If my income is $10,000 and someone else's income is $1 million, then the average income between the two of us is something like $500,000. but I don't make $500,000 and he doesn't make $500,000. Nobody actually makes that money. Meanwhile, the mean wealth would be quite a bit different. With two people, it's still the same, right? But as you get one rich person and 1,000 poor people, the average wealth might still be 20,000 or something. But the mean wealth, like if you throw a dart, and who are you most likely to hit? You're most likely to hit a poor person making $100 a year or something like that. I mean, and so a question I think that should be asked in this instance, as economically, is that how dangerous is wealth disparity? What is the cost of wealth disparity? What is the cost of an income disparity? Once it gets too large, you have the problems I mentioned before about a narrowing economic base, about political instability because of this, about an entire change in the social structure, about the importance of capital over growth, the importance of how rich your grandparents were versus how hard you work yourself. It's harder for new businesses to start, so old businesses begin taking over, and so on. You can't compete. The entire economy tends to stagnate, and you have a bunch of people living in subsistence instead of a good life, or a lifetime of improving quality of life. And this is something I think that I would like views like this to sort of answer. How bad is wealth disparity, and what economic problems does that cause? Because being a disparity of riches, it must cause some economic effect. And what is that? I think it's probably a negative effect. But is there an argument on the other side? Is it an argument that, hey, a few very, very rich people actually have a positive negative effect, as opposed to a bunch of relatively not that well-off folk? This is, I think, very debatable, but it's the argument for something like trickle-down economics, except that in my experience as an American, as a millennial American, trickle-down economics is an absolute crock of BS. And that doesn't work. Not as I've seen it, at least. Just an excuse for lowering taxes on the rich. Of course, that's my personal experience. And I'm sure there's some study or group out there that can fudge the numbers and end up with whatever result you want, but what is the general trend or belief, right? What do 30 or 40 or 50 studies tend to lead us towards? I don't really know the answer. Trickle-down economics, I don't think it works. I've never seen it work. But I'm sure it works for somebody somewhere. And they don't, the argument against wealth tax, I think, well, if you don't support a wealth tax and income disparity is increasing, which it has been, then what's the answer? What do you do? They'll have some answers later, which I think are not very good. Yeah. So it says, consequently, wealth taxes don't raise much money. And a large-scale review by the OECD found limited arguments for net wealth taxes on top of those on capital gains and inheritance. Net wealth taxes on top of those on capital gains and inheritance. Well, I'm fine with that. Taxing capital gains, go ahead. Taxing inheritance, capital gains. I mean, later they said that President Joe Biden floated the idea of a tax on unrealized capital gains, which would have been a wealth tax of sorts. But so you can taxing realized capital gains, but not unrealized capital gains. And this is another sort of question to ask. If you're taxing capital gains, what of those should you tax? There are inherent issues, I think, with taxing unrealized capital gains, but there may also be a benefit. It forces money to move around. It forces somebody to sell their investment, the unrealized capital gains, in order to pay a tax, and then they must use that money somewhere, and they have to get a better return than the 2% or whatever tax it is on unrealized capital gains in order to verify that. This has the effect of mixing ownership of companies. It also has the effect of reducing the overall value of companies, because you have parts of their stock are being sold, which lowers the price. Being forcefully sold, which lowers the price. You know that somebody has to sell a certain amount of the stock for monies they have to pay to the government and so on. The value doesn't keep this value doesn't keep investing in the company, and so the company isn't worth quite as much. But that doesn't really impact. I guess in my view, right? That doesn't really impact the value of the company. That impacts the value of the stock market, and the stock market is not the company. It is a part of the company. It affects the loans the company can get, the returns it can get, because it can always, if it needs to raise money, sell some of its stock. But it also it affects, as far as I can tell, mainly those people who own parts of the company. That is, the company has already raised its money through selling its initial, selling of stock, and if the stock has gone up 50% since then, the company doesn't benefit from this directly. It only benefits if it sells stock. And I don't know, like, how do you tax a corporation on the selling of its own stock, right? When you tax unrealized realized capital gains once it has entered the public arena, that's a question I don't really know the answer to. But it does lead into another sort of question here. And I thought this was interesting enough to actually go and research a bit. They claim here, in America, effective tax rates now rise from 2% for the bottom quintile of income to 45% for the top 0.1, according to a recent study by David Splinter of America's Joint Committee on Taxation. Tax systems in most other rich countries are also highly progressive. So I looked that up, because it directly contradicts information I've heard. Where it says effective tax rates are now 45% for the top 0.1%. And 45% effective, 45% tax rate, that seems reasonable level until I looked into it. So what that actually is, if you read the study by David Splinter of America's Joint Committee on Taxation, is that income taxes among the rich are just like the 25% mark. And the remaining percentage difference, the 20% more or less, the graphs he gives on the paper aren't exact, right? Is actually corporate taxations. Taxes on corporate income, taxes on wages, need for the corporation to pay for insurance and healthcare and things like that. So 45% for the top 0.1. Okay, why is it 45% for the top 0.1%? Because as far as I understand it, the reason today that someone is wealthy, in like the top 0.1%, the top 1% of wealth, is because they own companies, or they own stock in companies. They own a percentage of the stock market. Is where the vast majority of the ultra-rich's wealth is in unrealized capital gains in the stock market, right? Like Elon Musk is not worth $600 billion or whatever. That is, he doesn't have $600 billion in his pocket. And if he sold everything he has, he couldn't raise $600 million because he'd be selling stocks so fast it would tank the price. So in a way, it's quite fake, the income and the wealth of the top 0.1%. But another way it's quite real in that it demonstrates the outsized effect that an individual has upon the economy. And to me, it is disingenuous. It is deceptive to say that the effective income rate is 55% for the top 0.1% of people, because they're not paying the corporate taxes directly. The corporation is paying those taxes. And I understand there's an argument to be made here that you have a wealth in a corporation that hasn't been realized as income, that isn't really yours because it's in the corporation, and it could be lost at any time. But any wealth could be lost at any time. You could have dollars in your pocket and inflation goes up. You could own a house and it burns down. You could possess a rare video game and it breaks, or someone finds another one. You could have a Da Vinci portrait and it turns out it's fake. Right? Wealth can always be destroyed. Corporate wealth is just another version of this. And wealth includes cash, monies, gold, stock, and so on. But there is a large difference, it seems to me, between a tax paid by a corporation you own and a tax paid by you yourself. I didn't bring any water. It seems to me that, if I own a business and that business pays a bunch of taxes, there is something not quite right in adding the taxes of the business to the taxes on my personal self. Because the business is a wealth-creating entity. The business is monies and value in itself. It's like if I hire somebody to do a job and I have to pay some tax on them, payroll tax or something, right? Then that value, that payroll tax that I am paying, is a cost to me of hiring that employee, but is a cost that is not borne by me or the employee. It's a cost borne by the company. How do I explain that viewpoint I have, right? So if I hire somebody and I pay them $20 an hour, but it actually costs me $24 an hour to hire them because I have to pay taxes on them. I have to inboard them. I have to make sure I pay the insurance premiums on them and so on. But it also costs me $24. Then they're getting paid $20. I'm paying $24. So I must be getting value back from them at least equal to $24, or else I wouldn't be hiring them, or I wouldn't keep them for long. And so you see a discrepancy as an employee between what you're paid and the value the company's getting from you. You're saying, hey, I'm making $20 an hour, but the company is making more than that off of me. So the company's making a profit off of my labor. And if you see value as an employee, if you see value in the company, you're like, hey, the company organizes all this. The company does the paperwork. The company owns the building I work in. And if they didn't have this building or this restaurant or whatever, I wouldn't have a job. And they got to make money too. And they do something. They produce work. Then you don't really mind that. You're like, hey, I make some money. You make some money. It all works out. And if you represent the company, if you are like the CEO of the company and that's your identity or your job, then you see a profit, even though the extra money you're paying in order to keep this employee onward is just added on to the cost of have the employee work. You see a profit off of that. And then the profit value you see is added to the company. And the idea is that the owner of the company, who owns the stock in the company, actually receives that value, because they can take that money out in cash, if it is cash. They can take it out in a transfer of items, for example. You can say, I own the business. The business owns this building. I want the business to give me this building, and we'll take the value of that building out of the company, so that the company now owns fewer assets and is worth less. So even though the wealth has been transferred to me, I haven't actually lost money, even though the business has. So a business is a way to save monies. Essentially, it's like a bank of assets for an individual, a stock owner who owns money in a bank. Sorry, who owns money in who owns stock in a business. It's basically a bank. And the argument is that until you sell the company, you haven't actually made any money off of it. You've just gained wealth. It's like if I have a gold coin, and it's worth I bought it for $3,000, and gold goes up. Now it's worth $4,000. I haven't made any money until I sell the gold. Okay, that makes sense. The issue, I think, comes from in my mind at least, the issue comes from the difference between something like a mom and pop owned store and a person living off dividends from a giant company. At the very least, dividend taxes, you'd want to tax the dividends so that it can actually cost the company more money to give you money than the money they spend. That makes sense. I don't think I like that, actually. I don't know if I like dividend taxes. I would think that you just want to capture that tax at the income level. Probably, though, it's easier to administratively tax dividends. Get the tax that way. I suppose it doesn't really matter a whole lot. Perhaps part of the idea comes from, if you own a company, what value do you receive from that company in your daily life, in the way you live, right? If you are an owner and so you become a CEO, and so you get things like a private jet or a penthouse paid for by the company and things like these, and that should count as income for you. It's value receiving. It's the company spending money on itself, sort of bit, but that's not quite true, right? The company spending money on you. And I suppose the question really becomes, how realistic is it that somebody has $20 million worth of stock in a company and yet lives as if their true income was $100,000 that they get off the dividends? I suppose you would. It becomes kind of complicated, right? Saying effective tax rates, but it's really saying that corporate tax rates are half of the taxes that the rich folk pay. So if you want to raise taxes on rich folk, you raise taxes on corporations, except that the effect of this is if you raise taxes on corporations, what you actually are doing is you're depressing the economy, right? You're depressing commerce by raising taxes on corporations, because a corporation is a money-making entity. But if you raise taxes on the wealth of an individual, then you do not depress commerce. In certain cases, by inducing the sale of stock, you may actually give a boost to commerce by forcing movements of money. I'll have to think about this a little bit. It just seems odd because there is this sense, this feeling, right, that effective tax rates now are this percent, but that if you're super rich, there are ways to avoid this. There are ways to legally avoid paying taxes. You look at someone and you're like, oh, so and so actually they only paid $70,000 in taxes and they're a multi-billionaire. And you're going, okay, I understand that a lot of their value is in the company, but this seems absurdly low. And so you look at effective tax rates and you go, okay, what taxes are they paying? Like how is this happening? You don't get the sense today that the rich pay their fair share. And part of that might be because if half the taxes the rich pay are corporate taxes, then you don't see this. Coca-Cola paid a bunch of money in taxes this year. Okay. What about the people who own Coca-Cola? Oh, they paid an effective tax. They paid a tax rate, an income tax rate of 25%. And you're going, they paid that seems a little odd. And someone is saying they paid an effective tax rate of 45%. I'm going, that's not what I hear. That's not what I see. That's not the experience I get. So you don't want to just ask how the effective tax rates are, but how visual are the tax rates? What are the effect of these different types of taxes? If the rich are paying an effective tax rate of 45%, then why on earth wouldn't you do something like reduce corporate taxes and raise income taxes on the rich to 45% instead of 25%? You're claiming you're doing the same thing, right? But that's not what is happening. You read this study by David Splinter of the American Joint Committee on Taxation, and he says that there has been an equalization of corporate and income taxes. Corporate taxes have gone up a little bit, income taxes have gone down a little bit, and that seems backwards. Like, why is that happening? You're depressing commerce in order to protect the wealth of the super rich, is what that means to me. Is what that says to me. Like, what? Okay, so and one of the arguments for not raising taxes on income is to raise corporate taxes instead. Raise taxes in corporations. On these corporations that have billions and billions of dollars of value in them, make them pay more taxes. And then you look at something like Walmart, and Walmart, biggest employer in the United States, but they're also a wholesaler, a retailer, and their profit margin is like 1.2% or something. They have a ton of money and a ton of depth. They could survive economic troubles because of all the value in the company already, but they're not growing super fast with incomes of 1.2% until they hit a certain inflection level and they go into a town, they drive out all the other mom and pop businesses out of that small town, and they're the only place to buy t-shirts. Who are they competing with? Not just Target, but every shoe store, craft store, paint store, grocery store in the entire town. Every bakery in the entire town. And consumers may benefit from this, but eventually they don't benefit anymore, and you have the problem of corporate concentration, which means economic frailty and so on, which is the exact same problem you have with individuals. So then you really want to get involved in antitrust activity and ensuring that there are an effective number of corporations and then they don't collude. But where is the activity for the super rich, right? How do you ensure that the super rich don't collude in order to push economic theory and movements? Besides, antitrust law has definitely become less important over time. I understand part of this issue is because there is a focus on consumer benefits or the cost to a consumer, and not necessarily whether the market is healthy. This works in the short term, but in the long term, it can have negative effects, I would say, or I would suspect. But this is a bigger question and problem that I'll think about later on. Perhaps I can find a good book on like the history of corporate taxation and see what that is. Okay, but so to move on, it says the article. Governments will soon have to take painful decisions to close budget deficits. Necessary measures will probably include cuts to social services and increases in other sorts of taxes. To avoid a new wave of support for populism, or so the thinking goes, politicians will have to convince the public the rich are sharing the load. And this is, I think, very important. As someone who talks to people and watches the news, this is really the sense you get, at least in the United States. The rich are not paying their fair share. That there are tax loopholes and issues with corporations' ownership stock, the stock market itself. The value ratios. I was talking with someone today, and I'm like, I was an extremely low-level entry-level manager for a business, and my bonus was like $400, $600 or something. And then I saw my boss's bonus if we achieved the same metric for the store, and it was like $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 or something. I'm like, okay, I get it if like my boss was making 2 or 3 times my bonus, but when he's making like 15 times my bonus, like the jump in income disparity between different levels is ridiculous sometimes. Was the sense I get. I'm like, yeah, you're adding value to the company, but are you adding 15 times the value? That's I think rather debatable. That's very questionable. This isn't about my boss or whatnot. I think he was very good. It's just that I'm thinking, as I saw this, I'm going, that like the disparity, the jump is ridiculous. It's huge, beyond all proportion. And you look at that CEO pay, right? Part of the news you can read about is CEO pay since the 1980s has jumped from 20 times the minimum wage, the medium wage of the worker of that company, or the minimum wage, to like 400 times the wage of the average worker. And then so much more wealth, so much more value is thought to concentrate in these top levels. In the managers and the owners is where all the value is going instead of being shared. Like that's really the sense you get. And this bit here, governments will soon have to take painful decisions to close budget deficits. That just makes you angry. That makes you so angry as someone who grew up, and you hear about Social Security, Medicare, at least in the United States, right? That, hey, as I get older, I'll be taken care of. All I have to do, like one of the like something that's so annoying, at least in America, right, is we already have socialized healthcare. We already have the communist healthcare to the max. We have it. It exists right now. We voted for it. We support it. We do it all the time, everywhere, as long as you're over 65. Right? It already happens. So there's arguments about we shouldn't have a socialized healthcare. We do. All the people, all the movements who were before me, they voted for it. They wanted it. They argued for it. They sure as hell don't want it to be cut right now. But what happens when I'm 65? What happens in 30, 40 years? And the American budget deficit is 200% of GDP or whatnot, right? And we got to cut it because we can't afford it. And I'm going, something that seems off here. Something seems wrong. Like we could afford it then, but not now. And yet you look at the stock market, look at the value of America, and it's going up and up and up. I'm going, okay, it's easy to blame, oh, it's the foreigners taking your jobs. And I'm like, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like someone with a $400 million yacht is benefiting disproportionately. Compared to the person I was talking to today, who's like, maybe I want to buy a house someday, but I have to like change my entire spending habits around this issue. And so it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. If you're going to have taxes, and these taxes are on so and so and what, these also need to be visible taxes, right? People need to know these taxes are being paid, because I talk about, like, I don't know how much the 30 richest. I don't know how much Warren Buffett, for example, is evading taxes. Maybe he's not evading them at all, but I don't know that in any way whatsoever. Maybe all the value in the American stock market will be realized someday because people will sell it, or maybe the value will tank like a rock because the AI bubble bursts, and all of a sudden all the rich people are like, I don't have any money. I'm going, you had a bunch of money yesterday, you have no money today, right? And what happened? Did your income drop? No, your wealth dropped. And I'm like, well, you were in charge of this. You're responsible for this. Yet now I'm suffering because your wealth has dropped because of the stock market, because companies aren't hiring and they can't borrow money, and the whole thing gums up. I'm going, well, who is in charge, right? Who is taking on the risk? Because that's part of the issue. The super rich corporate guy, if the whole economy tanks and we're out of money, is he going to survive? Is he going to lose his house? Or is he going to have to sell his vacation home? He's going to have to sell his yacht. Meanwhile, I'll know people who are asking me, hey, do you think I can sleep on your couch for a couple weeks until I get back on my feet? Like the risk of economic problems, the risk of getting fired, for example, is totally different for or at least that's a feeling, at least, it's totally different for the ultra wealthy versus the regular peon. I grew up in I got out of school, to be more precise, during the financial crisis. 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12. That bit, we all got out and we're like, all right, we're going to find jobs. No, we're not going to find jobs. All right, we're going to get into some corporate environment and start climbing the ladder. No, we ain't. The number of people I know that are still working at like Walmart or Target or Safeway or whatnot at 30-ish, never managed to get any better, never managed to climb any higher. Or if they are, they're like, I was talking with a guy today and he's like, I'm a manager at so-and-so. And I got to tell people who've been working there for 30 years what to do, because he's a young person, and the other people he's telling he's got like 65-year-olds, 70-year-olds working at his place. He's like, I got to tell him what to do. Like, how do you have someone working like a minimum wage job for 30 years? That's the new normal. Part of the bit about for minimum wage is a minimum wage. As I understand it, a bit of the history of minimum wage is it was thought to apply to like these for example, fast food workers, minimum wage. And that was thought to be fine because you're not supposed to live on a minimum wage. It was a job for like high schoolers. It was a job for people kind of down in their luck. It was a job like just like survive at the bare minimum. That's what minimum wage was for. It was a summer job for high school kids. It was, I can sort of live in an apartment and I gotta work hard, get promoted. Then you have people working that as a career. And what happens? Well, the minimum wage needs to go up then, because it's not just a short-term job you get for 6 months. You're working there for 20, 30 years. at minimum wage levels, and you never climb any higher. And now all of a sudden, instead of being a subsistence wage, people are clamoring for it to be a livable wage. I want to be able to afford a house. I want to be able to afford a car. And I want to be able to save for retirement on my minimum wage. And why is that? Because people feel that they're stuck on that minimum wage. And this minimum wage, as minimum wage goes up, and corporations have to pay that minimum wage. So a rising of minimum wage is an indirect tax on corporations, which they, to an extent, pass along to the consumer. But again, you could just do something like tax corporate profits, or you could just tax unrealized capital gains for the owners, and then use that money to fund social services, to ensure that nobody ends up homeless or nobody ends up starving, to ensure that when a coal town dies off because we don't mine coal anymore, that all these people are able to be retrained and transferred over and moved around somewhere. Or they can learn remote work, or they retire early because they have health issues. All these bits, but instead you raise the minimum wage, which gives money, and then what happens is eventually the new minimum wage becomes the old minimum wage, because corporate profits will rise to a certain level. And so instead of doing these direct taxes, you're doing indirect taxes, which are, to me, appear depressive of commerce. There's an argument for doing something like raising minimum wage, because it is a more direct indirect tax, right? It is a tax from the corporation to its individual workers. They get paid more money instead of having to go through the government, who then buys a house, who then they have to apply for it. That's very inefficient. Just give it directly to people. Which is like, I would say, something like a direct payment makes a little more sense. That's a whole other argument to have. Could you cut social services from the government to the bone and replace that with like a direct payment to every person who makes less than $50,000 or whatnot? Hey, if you make less than $50,000, then we're going to pay you $3,000 a year, no matter what, and you can use that for whatever you want. Then all of a sudden you can afford a house, and there's somebody out there who's like, hey, the minimum wage that any person makes just by surviving the United States is $700 a month. So I'm going to supply housing and food for $700 a month. At that level, can you replace the entire government run social services system by private social services system, just paying people directly? This has massive problems, of course. Like, if you're mentally ill, people can get gypped out of their money. People can be put into basically slave labor. And government social services, theoretically at least, have oversight in them to prevent this from happening. But it's a sort of debate to have. It goes back to this bit here, though. Politicians will have to convince the public the rich are sharing the load. Else you end up with social problems, right? I mean, why did Donald Trump get elected? Because a bunch of folk felt that they've been getting poorer the last 30 years, and they wanted something different. I mean, I may think that most of what he says is a lie and isn't good economic sense, but he's at least standing up there and saying he'll fix the economy. Meanwhile, the other side, Kamala and Democrats sort of like, guess, oh, do this, we'll kind of do that. Well, then if we raise these taxes and do these things, then it should help fix push the economy in the right direction, right? And meanwhile, the guy on the street is just going, I heard so-and-so about a $400 million yacht, and I'm losing my house. Something seems wrong here. Okay, so they say that this is a seductive argument. It sounds good to have a wealth tax, but it's misguided, is the claim. They claim it for three reasons. First, on procedural grounds, hey, you're an economist, you shouldn't be involved in that. That's politics. Do a political thing. I mean, if you want to change the entire economic system of the way the United States works, if you want to manage capitalism and change the entire procedure we use to define riches or quality, if you want to shift the tax burden all the way away from indirect taxation to almost entirely direct taxation, well, these are economic ideas which are political in nature and therefore outside the realm of the economist claim. And I think that's wrong, right? You can have a totally economic view of something, and then what you do is you're working within the system, right? And you're saying, hey, this system is fine. We don't need to change anything. We'll modify a few of the, we'll change a few of the knobs, and it'll work fine. That also limits your view, right? How do you know you've hit the best economic system? What else can you change? You end up being stuck in a rabbit hole. It's like that book on white frailty I was reading, right? We don't even talk about racism. We don't even talk about massive economic changes. And so the flaws of the system you have, the flaws of the economic system we have in the United States just become magnified over time and cause their own issues. A saying that because we're a scientist, we don't look at the effect our science has. I'm like, look, you invented TNT, right? You can't sit there and be like, well, I invented TNT, but I'm not responsible for how people use it or what. I'm like, yes, you are. You made it. You showed people what to do. It's your baby. You created it. And it's not like, TNT is a creature with a will of its own who you can't control. No, it's a thing. It's an idea you made and released out into the world. And if you release the idea that we should all, murder the bourgeois, or that communism is evil, or that, I don't know, so-and-so is perfect, or so-and-so, no matter what ideas they say must be voted, must be bad, right? Then you limit yourself. You're stuck in a certain area. And I think it behooves you to, if you mentioned TNT, it can be used to destroy, but let me try and show people what else it can be used for, right? It's used for construction. It can be used for making dams, right? It can be, maybe you can modify it to be used in fireworks. Like, what else can you do with it? You make an idea and you let it out, and you're like, well, I don't have anything to do with it anymore. It's your baby. It's your meme. There's a difference between creating a life and life acting in a certain way versus creating something like a company or whatnot. That is an idea that is not free will. Instead, it has static effects. And so you know what happens. Like if I invented today a way to make a nuclear bomb out of paper, or I invented a way to 3D print a gun, or I invented a way to make antimatter in my basement, then it behooves us to ask, what effect would my idea have? If I showed people how to do this thing, and then people do that thing, I let it loose. You can claim, hey, someone would have figured it out eventually. I think there's validity in that. But it also doesn't seem quite right to me to be like, well, someone else would have discovered it eventually, so I'm going to let it loose without trying to guide it, without trying to suggest the good in it, as well as and putting out the warnings about the bad. right? Saying like someone else would have invented TNT at some point, so I'm not responsible for how TNT is used. And it's entirely different to me than it's like if you invent TNT and you let it loose. You know how it's going to be used. You invented an explosion. You invent 3D guns. You know exactly how it's going. It doesn't require a lot of thought process. To go, oh, people are gonna print 3D guns in their houses and use it to protect themselves. No, they're going to print 3D guns in their houses and use it as a gun to protect themselves or to shoot somebody else. Right? This is exactly what happens. You sit there and be like, well, this is for self-defense. Yeah, one use. If people use it as bad, it's not my responsibility. Yes, it is. You know what you were doing. The good and the bad is a result of your creation. Someone may have created it eventually, but maybe someone might not have, right? Or someone may have created it eventually, but it's entirely different from like at least trying to push the ideas, at least trying to put in some safeguards around your system. I think there's an argument if you realize that you cannot put any safeguards around it, but then you may want to push the messaging, right? TNT is great for construction. 3D printing guns are great for home defense. And you try to get people to see that view. It's the same in any science or in economics, right? Economics has to do with money and how people spend it and how people live, and this necessarily inflicts with politics. So trying to stay out of it is just, I think it doesn't work. I think you shoot yourself in the foot. I think you limit your own ideas. By avoiding intersectionality of your situation, you fail to utilize the ideas to the level at which they may be used. As an economist, ask these questions. Can we change the system entirely? Is there a better way? Or at the very least, if I am saying that we should increase taxes in this way or reduce taxes in that way, what is the outsized effects? What is that going to result in? Does it lead to income disparity? If it leads to income disparity, what does that do? What effect does that have upon the economic system? It narrows it. It creates political change, so on and so on. He says, leave politics to the politicians. And this is wrong. This is what I say. Don't leave politics to the politicians. The politicians are us. There is this view that, hey, we elect someone, we put them in charge, and then they do things, and we just sit here and let them happen to us. So, I elected someone. I voted for someone. They work for me. They represent me. And I'm going to criticize them at every turn when they do things I don't like. And I'll praise them when they do things that I agree with. I think I made it clear, I'm not really a fan of the Republicans. And this is because I think the messaging they give out is not what they actually do. But I'm also not really a fan of the Democrats because the messaging they give out is also not what they actually do. And so, what do I like? Who do I praise? This is more difficult every day. Recently, a bit about the war in Israel and Palestine, and there was a ceasefire between them. I'm like, good for you. You managed to broker a ceasefire. Good job, right? I'm like, hey, Donald Trump, you may have been late to the party, but it looks like a ceasefire is actually getting done, or at least on the way, and hey, good job. I may have doubts about how well it's going to hold up, but hey, I'll praise you for that. And there are instances of deregulation I think are a good idea. And there are instances I think are bad ideas. You have to balance these causes. And pretending that we aren't part of the system, pretending that we aren't a a voter in the United States. So, I think a lot of people do this. A lot of people feel this and believe this. Hey, I don't have any power, or I don't really care what happens. I don't get involved in politics. I don't get involved. It's not worth it to me. It's not worth the trouble and the problem. Well, politics is involved in you. Is my argument there. It's like people who claim, well, I don't vote because I think the system is illegitimate. All you're doing is helping the system. It's helping the system at that point. There's a difference between standing aside and saying, this is too important to me right now, or a difference, or saying like, I choose to fight in my own way. Like if you don't vote, but you involve yourself in social activities, right? If you try to help the homeless, I'm like, yeah, sure. You think that you want to change the world in a different way. It's when you don't vote and then you complain about what politicians do. I'm like, well, that's illegitimate there, right? If you don't vote and you don't get involved in politics at all, you don't think about it, well, that's fine. Do your own thing. You may improve the world in your own way, but be aware that politics is going to get involved in you, going to affect your Social Security, your Medicare, And I don't think it's very smart to sit outside and let it happen. But hey, you do that. It's when I hear people who say I don't vote and then they complain about the system, say it's illegitimate, and they complain about what a politician does, and like, well, you didn't vote for anybody, so why are you involved in this? Leave politics to the politicians, they say. I'm like, we are politicians. You start talking about economics on a social or national level. You're a politician. That involves it in politics. It involves it in what people do and how they move, what they believe. How money is spent, and the effects it has. Don't just stay out of it because that's for the politicians. Come on. Okay. Then it says there are more substantive objections. Wealth tax arguments fail on the grounds of durability, utility, and nativity. It says, I think this one is probably the most pertinent. Begin with durability. Zuckman-style taxes may be popular for the moment, yet continued support is far from guaranteed since the public has particular views when it comes to taxation. Americans, for instance, say that they want progressive taxes, but when asked about particular levies, also hate progressive taxes the most. This is something I've definitely noticed. Like, oh, I hate I think that we should raise taxes on everyone but me. And the me in this case also includes a economic range that is gigantic. Because they don't just mean me; they mean the me that I'm going to be in 20 years. I'm going to be a millionaire in 20 years, so we shouldn't raise taxes on millionaires. I'm like, dude, you make $30,000 a year. What are you talking about? We shouldn't raise taxes on millionaires. This isn't. What do you think you're going to be a millionaire in 10 years, in 20 years? So we shouldn't raise taxes on them now, just in case it affects you. Maybe. I'm like, dude, this is part of the American dream, the American view, right? Hey, I'm going to be rich. I'm going to make it. So we shouldn't raise taxes on the rich folk because they'll be me one of these days. I'm like, yeah, maybe. But with rising levels of income disparity, that becomes less and less likely each year. But by forbearing to tax them now, you are hurting your chances of becoming one of them, is the argument I would make there. But also, there's the sense of fairness. Hey, they worked hard for the money. They deserve it. I worked hard for money. I deserve it. And the argument used for raising taxes on them is the same as the argument used for raising taxes on me. And this is a slippery slope argument. We're going to end up destroying the entire system and becoming communist by raising taxes on the rich. And so you end up arguing against taxes. You're for the idea, but not the particularities. It's like buildings, like building housing in California, right? The number of articles I see, the number of people I've talked to, we need to build more houses. We need to make more houses. And then you submit a proposal, and then half the community comes out against it. Because it might depress their housing. It might destroy their views. It might just depress their housing values. The construction is going to be a lot of noise. I mean, seriously, the construction is being a lot of noise, and so I don't think we should allow for this construction. We should build houses, but not where I live. We should build houses, but not in this area. Someone else should do this, and yeah, that's what people vote for again and again and again and again and again. I like the idea. I like the general idea of, let's say, electric cars and green energy. But I also like my gas guzzling, Jeep. Or oh yeah, I like the idea of electric cars, but I don't like that we are subsidizing green energy, or I don't like that we are buying batteries from China, or I don't like the taxes we have to pay on these cars, or it seems unfair that I have a gas guzzling car and I'm paying all these taxes and gases, but the electric cars aren't paying any taxes on their electricity, and so I'm paying an unfair burden, and so I don't like it. In the particularities, this happens again. Pick any issue you like, and there's going to be a substantial part of America, as far as I can tell, who likes the idea in general, but not in particular. When it comes time to actually doing something or actually arguing for something, then you end up relying on progressives to push something and push it and push it and push it for years and years and years, hoping something changes. And there's always going to be someone arguing against it. There's always going to be someone standing up in the city council room saying, I just like it for these ideas, for every single idea you will ever have. And because of this, you're going to end up having a flow back and forth, right? The government is for this and then against this, and then for this and against this, and we elect someone new and they're against this, and we elect someone new and they're for this, and this idea is going through the community, and all of a sudden everyone thinks that bike lanes are great, and then then eventually they think the bike lanes are bad, and we start dismantling them. You have this ebb and flow and ebb and flow. So if you're going to have taxes on the rich, then I think one of the problems to overcome is really a more scientific basis for these taxes. Saying something like, I want to tax the millionaires, but look, if you're a millionaire and you live in San Francisco, that don't mean you're rich. If you're a millionaire and you live in Eureka, that means you're rich, for the area you're at. And saying like, I want to tax the ultra wealthy, but okay, how do you actually do that? I think a direct wealth tax is at least more clearly understood. It's very obvious what's going on. You're not doing something like, okay, we're going to tax corporate profits, and then if you have an upper middle income, then you see the stock market the stock price tank, and you're going, oh my gosh, the stock price is tanking on my corporation. I'm losing money for my retirement because of this. Now, I might argue that you are gaining from this in government subsidies. If you're over 65, then you're probably benefiting very heavily from this, or you will likely benefit very heavily from almost any possible taxes you paid in your entire life. Right? You get cancer once, and Medicare helps to cover that. Every tax you've ever paid, value has been returned to you, because it probably costs $10,000 or $100,000 or $200,000 for your cancer treatments. You end up going into kidney failure. You have to become involved in dialysis, and Medicare helps pay for that. Hey, that's a ton of money, ton of value you're getting that you would have had to pay otherwise. And maybe you pay it to a private insurance company, but then your premiums go up and up and up. And you have those problems. The same problem ends up happening, I understand, in the government. That an extremely large amount of government expenditure is in our socialized medicine right now, is in our Medicare. and eventually you have to, you either borrow money for that, or you raise taxes. And hey, when it comes to my turn, when I'm 65 in 30 years, what is going to happen, right? Is Medicare going to be less? Are advances in medicine and production going to match so that the expenditure gives me the same quality or better quality? Or am I going to have to pay a ton of taxes, or is quality going to dip? What's going to go on? I want more. I want assurance, assurity. I want safety. I want to know. And you can argue like, oh, we're going to do this change to Social Security, for example, to make it solvent. Right? I don't want to hear about emergency measures and emergency measures and emergency measures and emergency measures, and government shut down as they argue over the budget again and again and again. I want something that I'm like, okay, you know what? This mostly works. Or I want something where the government budget deficit is below inflation, so that we can borrow more money if we want. I want to hear that the government is borrowing 250% of GDP this year. And paying 14% of our taxes are going to the interest payments, and it does sort of feel like that. So how do you argue a wealth tax? You can say, well, tax the ultra rich. Who are the ultra rich? How are you taxing them? What's the process for this? If that's not clear, if you're just standing up there giving slogans, then someone else is going to come behind you and give a different slogan. All of a sudden, nobody knows what's going on. And it really does feel that political discourse in the United States, at least, actually in quite a lot of places, given that I keep a little bit up on EU, Mexican, and some of the Asian news, occasionally African news, that, I mean, where is the politician that is standing on the scientific grounds of his system? Where is the politician that is pulling out a chart and saying, look, if we do this, then this happens. If we do this, then this happens, right? I'm arguing for this because of these reasons. And if you want to know more, then here's a YouTube video of me talking about it for an hour and a half. Here is a paper you can read about. Instead, you go online and it's like a bunch of graphs and figures, and you're going, do I understand this? Like, what's being hidden here? Then you read someone else, and their tax policy is this, and they're saying, well, this happens. And it's like, I was reading through this, the study here they mentioned by David Spinter. And it's like, I'm reading, I'm going back and forth, and I'm trying to understand what's going on. It's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of letters. You need to be able to not just have a scientifically literate populace, but have a method of explaining this scientific literacy, this scientific information, so that it is understandable and comprehensible, right? If your enemy has a slogan, then you need to be able to stand up and say, no, this is a lie and this is why, right? Why do so many young people believe in climate change? I think it's because we've seen graphs, we've seen figures. We're like, hey, look at the CO2 going up here. Look at, in my lifetime, changes in the weather. It used to be, if you go out in October, it was freezing. Now we had 2 days of cold, and I'm wandering around in shorts and a t-shirt. And I very clearly remember being 10, this not happening. I remember there used to be snow on the ground once in a while, and haven't seen that. I remember that the river at my grandma's ranch used to run all year, and then you go, and it's lower than you've ever seen it. You used to hear about the droughts, and you have a few good years, and then you have a few more droughts, and you get older, you realize, okay, things seem to be going exactly like I was told they were going. Prices seem to get higher. We seem to have a major forest fire every year now. And partially I'm asking, do we have forest fires like that before in California? Did I just not pay attention? Is it just that it's in the news now all the time? I'm not, entirely sure, but I think that's why people tend to feel younger people tend to believe in climate change more, because they've had the scientific literacy to understand what's going on, and they've been told this information again and again and again. Meanwhile, the other side is just like slogans, scientific, it's not real, or it is due to the Earth's cooling cycle or whatnot. It's always someone else. And I think, referencing that speech about taking the easy path that I read a few weeks ago, weeks ago, a short time ago. You really do get that sense as a millennial in America today that a lot of people want us to take an easy path. Hey, don't worry about climate change. Don't worry about electrification. Don't worry about the oil industry. Don't worry about rising income disparity. Don't worry about a dangerous world. Focus on, we're gonna lower taxes. We're gonna spend more money in the military. We're gonna be tougher on the world. It's like tariffs. What do tariffs say? Tariffs say that the rest of the world is taking advantage of us. It's someone else's fault. It's not our fault. And that seems odd. I've seen that story before. I've heard that story before. It's not my fault. But they're right about the durability here. So if you're going to have wealth taxes, you want to have, I would argue myself that if you're going to have wealth taxes, you base them on a percentage of GDP or GNP, right? You base them on the total wealth of the country. You do not say, we're going to tax income over $100 million. You don't say that. You do not do that. Because at that point, who knows how much $100 million is? If I'm making $30,000 or $20,000 or $50,000 or $100,000 a year, what does $30 million mean to me? What is they have income? They have wealth of $100 million. I don't know. What is that even? How much is that money? It's a nebulous figure. And I think, well, maybe I'll be that rich someday. Maybe their wealth is really in stock and it's not actual wealth. There's always an excuse, an idea. What you do is, instead of saying we're going to raise taxes on $100 million, to 2% on wealth over $100 million. We're going to have 2% taxes on wealth that is more than 0.00073% of GDP or GNP, or pick a number that more or less represents some production or some wealth or some value. If the number is, you can nationalize bits of information about the stock market, for example. If a company's stock is more than 4% of the entire stock market, then that company needs to split up. One company should not have that much effect upon the entire stock market, for example. If there's one retailer that takes over 40% of the market, then it needs to split up or reduce its market share below 40% because that's injurious. You make it about percentages of the max. You say that we're not taxing, people whose wealth is $100 million. We're taxing people whose wealth is an outsized effect, or whose wealth is an outsized percentage of the total wealth. We're saying that you can get so rich in America, but beyond that, you become dangerous. This is a slippery slope, of course. But I think it's less of a slippery slope to say we're going to tax, 0.00075% single wealth or single value entities, versus we're going to tax people who make $100 million. Because inflation hits and somebody's on the edge, they're very upset by that. And of course, if you have progressive taxes, you want them at a very graduated level. You don't want to jump, 5%, 5%, 5%. Hey, you want it 1%, 20%, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. You end up at 50% or whatnot. Make it a graduation there. Is what I would argue, because it's much easier to understand. It's much less disruptive, and it's easier to explain. I think this is something that is not really studied very well. How do you explain the reasons for your policies? How do you communicate the reasoning behind what you do and why you vote for things? It's very easy to argue with the rich aren't paying their fair share. To have a slogan like that. It's very difficult to say that there is a concentration of wealth that is reaching a level which we last saw in the 1850s. And here's what politics were like in the 1850s. And here's what I think is going to happen. You need an educated populace, but you also need to educate the populace. Bernie Sanders, I think, tends to be okay with this, tends to be a little better with this. You listen to him speak long enough, and he'll sit there and explain sort of why he's arguing this, and explain his ideas. Meanwhile, there's all sorts of other politicians I hear about. Like, they stand up and they give a speech, and it's about some ideas, it's slogans, or they castigate their opponent. They're standing in the way. They're trying to attack you, trying to change your culture, trying to damage your children. They're trying to take advantage of the system, depending on who it is. And if you're in the crowd, you understand that, you cheer, you agree. Then you go home, you think about it, and you go, wait, how exactly are they taking advantage of the system? Or you think, oh, we should tax capital, we should tax, capital gains. You think, wait, are we taxing realized capital gains or unrealized capital gains? What effect does that have? Where do you go to learn about this stuff? I can go to a politician's website, and there will be a infographic. There'll be a short explanation about their ideas. Sometimes there'll be a link to a paper which support things. But I don't often see if it's general education on economic topics. If I want to learn that about that, I'm going to a YouTuber, right? I'm not going to the news. I'm going to read a book. I'm not going to a politician to learn all about a system, because he's going to spend half his time convincing me that he's right. It's rarer these days to see substantive debates, and they aren't as much of a focus. Right? You tune into the presidential debate, but you don't really always tune into the vice presidential debate. And if there is a primary debate, hey, you don't really always tune into that. I receive notifications about the city council meeting in my own town, and I read the news once in a while, but I don't really engage with it. And perhaps I should. So it does feel that I can be a bit of a hypocrite in that sense. I'll speak about other countries, and I'll speak about the national news, and I'll speak about all these grand ideas. But when it comes to my own town, I don't want to get involved. There was a debate apparently at one of the city council meetings about some billboard they were going to put up, and I was reading on some Facebook post someone had made about, oh, this is unfair and bad, and they're going to vote for it anyway. And then I read in the newspaper a week later, oh yeah, they voted exactly how this random person on Facebook said they were going to do. And the sense you really get is this was all decided beforehand. And to go, okay, I may think that this billboard action is unfair. I think there's something fishy here. I might think that because they voted for that, I'm less likely to vote for them. But I'm also thinking, it's a small thing. It's a small bit. This is one part of a complicated situation. Who knows? I mean, I've been in organizations. You don't know all the backdoor talk that's going on. You don't know all the reasons for why this is done. And politicians' systems benefit from that. So you want to, again, so going back to wealth taxes, right? You want to base that on more scientific value. And there is not a clear argument for the scientific value of what a wealth tax should be, the degree it should be, the worth and it has. You have this sort of historical evidence that it's low, but then you have like that book on the 21st capital in the 21st century saying that there were a bunch of exemptions to it, and that's why it didn't turn out very well. Or all the rich people left, and the politicians started panicking because the rich people were supporting them, and now they're gone. Or the rich people are now supporting their enemies, their political enemies, because they care about the taxes and they're doing taxes, and all these issues end up happening. How do you? I guess the question is, like, when you have a tax rate, how do you decide on that tax rate, and how well, as a politician, as an economist, can you explain to the public why that tax rate is the rate it is? Taxes on California are like what, like $1.80 per gallon of gas. Why? Is that what is needed to repair the roads? Is that how much they think they could get before commerce is depressed to an unreasonable level? Like, how is this decided on? And I'm sure I could find out. I'm sure there's papers and politicians who are glad to explain it to me. I'm sure there's an economist somewhere who said, well, this is why. But I have to go searching for that information. And that's probably the bit which I'm talking about here. You have to go searching for that information. It's not simply told to you. Right? You drive down the freeway and there's construction. You see a little sign saying, "Done with your tax dollars." But what if I want to learn more? What do you like? It says "done with your tax dollars," but there's got to be a study somewhere of how effective that is. There's got to be an accounting of the tax money, and this is available to me because it's public money and public information, a public contract. I'd have to go searching for it, and theoretically, this job is done by journalists. There's value in it, but we know that journalism has suffered in recent years. You have a very quick news cycle. You have a news cycle that is focused on sensationalism more often than not. You have less print media. You have a more scattered media. And as a politician, what can you do about this? As an economist, what can you do about this? YouTube videos help, I feel. How many of us have at some point found a YouTube video by some totally obscure person who spent way more time than you or I would ever do on a investigation of a building in their town being knocked down, right? Of some local corruption scandal. Or someone who's like, "Oh, I'm going to really investigate the light bulb, the history and the politics of the light bulb," or I'm going to make a lightsaber, a plasma lightsaber by myself, or I'm going to make a suit of Iron Man armor, and I'm going to film it for 50 hours worth of work that I spent on it, and then edit that and make it interesting. There are still individuals out there who care about these things very much. It's just that finding the value in it, and especially as a as a politician, I think there's a question we need to ask ourselves: do you, as a politician, want an educated or an uneducated populace? Do you want a populace that understands why you are voting a certain way for certain things, who you can explain your reasoning to, or do you want a populace that you can convince with slogans? Do you want a populace that just votes for you because you're red or blue? And what kind of politicians do we want as people? The ones who can explain why their actions are being taken, the ones who are willing to stand up and argue and debate with folk? Or do we want the ones who they get interviewed? We've all seen this, right? They get interviewed on a talk show or in a radio show, and they don't answer a single one of the bloody questions. Right? They say, I want to ask, Mrs. So-and-so, I want to ask about this. And say, well, that's a very interesting question, Kyle, but I think the real question is da-da-da-da. Or you're listening to him talk for 5-10 minutes, you realize they haven't told you a single thing. They've just been like meandering and back and forth. And I do this, right? I start talking about something that the next thing I know, 25 minutes later, I'm on a totally different topic. So I'm a little at fault there as regards my speeches. My exchange of information, I tend to meander. So I can see why other people do it, but you also get the sense that, oh wow, this guy's really a slime bag, right? Or they refuse to answer any questions because they think that what they say is going to be used as a soundbite by somebody in some advertisement that or some news bit where their claim is entirely taken out of context. So they're very careful on what they say, and I mean there are bits and pieces like you want to be like, oh well, why do you want to punish good gun owners? If you want to pass laws limiting gun ownership. Why do you hate guns? Why do you want to punish good gun owners? And this is a deceptive question, right? But how do you answer it? You try to say, well, look, that's not a fair question. Let me try to move the dial. Let me try to explain why that's not a fair question. Let me answer you, but it's going to take me like 5 minutes. I have to tell you what I'm actually answering. I mean, or do you bite the bullet and say, yeah, I don't like guns, and this is why, and this is what the law is going to pass. Yeah, and I'm not going to. I think that these aspects of the gun laws are rock solid. I think these make sense, but I think these other things need to be torn down because they cause problems. Or say, like, how often do you have the feeling that a politician is giving you a straight answer? I think this happens rather often, actually, with like mid-level politicians. It doesn't really feel like city council gives you a whole lot of straight answers. And it doesn't really feel like national, governors and presidents, whatnot, congressmen give you straight answers. But you talk to your state representative, and it's some guy who went to a local church, doesn't make a lot of money, and is more or less involved in the community. And hey, they'll answer you straight up. Hey, this is why this is going on. That's why this is going on. Because they don't have a lot to lose. They're not aiming for a national level political position. They don't think that they're going to be in politics, until they're 89. They're 52 or 40 or something. And they just want to sort of, do their part for the community, and then they'll retire in a little bit and, move on, do something else. This is just something they do. They'll give you a straight answer because they don't have much invested in it. Hey, I lost an election. Oh, well, I guess I'll go back to my normal life. But you have a career politician, someone who's been in his elected position since he was 25, and now he's 72. He's been in Congress for 40 years or something. And what do you mean? If I lose my political position, I won't have a regular life to get back to. He's not going to give you a straight answer. Hell no. Someone who's been in Congress for 40 years. Whose entire life revolves around this. Someone who's 82 and still in the Senate. Shoot, this is his entire life. He's going to do whatever it takes to remain in power, to remain in his position, because he doesn't have an ordinary life to go back to. So I would probably trust a politician more who doesn't have to be a politician. Okay, so second utility. Even if wealth tax remained popular at its introduction, would have achieved the goals sought by supporters. The French public would enjoy poking plutocrats in the eye, but the joy would almost certainly be fleeting. The tax would not raise enough money to offset required cuts elsewhere. Any momentary jubilation would surely give way to incandescent rage once the government announced, say, reduction in disability benefits or a modest rise in the retirement age. And this, I think, is somewhat important. We have a wealth tax on the rich. We redistribute the wealth. That isn't gonna fix all our problems. That isn't going to magically make the budget better. You're still going to have to raise taxes on other things. You're still going to have to make spending cuts. You know, when you have a 5 or 7% budget deficit going on for 50 years, that isn't solved by taking a bunch of money from rich folk. The effect of a wealth tax, I would argue, is not to raise money. It is to lower wealth disparity. And this is a societal level change which takes place over a very long time. This is part of the reason why it's hard to argue for wealth taxes, because it says, oh, the rich should suffer now so that everybody else has a better life in 15 years. Right? And the longer you aim for as a result, the more difficult it is to claim that we should sacrifice today. Right? It is relatively easy, I think, for rando on the street to say, I want to go to a rave. I want to go to a convention. And I want to go to the Aftershock concert. And in order to do so, I need to save $400 for tickets, $400 for transportation and food. I need to save $800 in the next 7 months. All right, let me do that. And they can do it. I think people when they have that short-term goal, I want to I need to save up $3,000 for a down payment on a car. I'm going to do it. And they can do it. And they will sacrifice. They will work extra hours. They will take extra jobs. They'll survive on beans and rice. You know, they won't go out drinking for weeks, months even, in order to achieve that. And I think that that's very doable. But when it comes to, for example, all right, I'm going to save $3,000 in an IRA this year so that in 50 years, that $3,000 is $30,000 that I can use for my retirement. That's much more difficult, right? I'm not going to see the results of my investment for half my lifetime. It's a long distance. And all of a sudden you're like, oh gosh, I need some money for a car payment. I'm going to get kicked out of my apartment because I can't cover the rent. And let me draw from my retirement for it. So you do, and then you don't think, oh my gosh, I am sacrificing $25,000 tomorrow so that I can make $5,000 today. No, you're thinking, okay, I'm paying 30% taxes. I'm taking this out early. I know that sucks. I'm only getting a 70% return on the money I put in. But if you're thinking, oh, I'm getting a negative 400% return on the money I put in, you look at that a little differently. And this, I think, is part of the danger of a wealth tax. You pass a wealth tax, and it raises a little bit of money. And theoretically, it has an effect upon the way society is organized. It means that we have a larger middle class 20 years from now. Just assuming that like that the book The Capital in the 21st Century is mostly right, then it means we have a larger middle class. It means that more people have been lifted out of poverty than they would have been otherwise. We are richer off and better off as a country because we have this wealth tax in 20 years. And then how do you prove it, right? Oh, well, if we hadn't passed this wealth tax, then it's likely that the middle class would have shrunk by this amount. But because we did pass the wealth tax, we think the middle class grew by this amount, right? How do you prove these things? You can't. It's counterfactual. Well, if that had happened, then this would have happened, right? The same problem comes today, right? Well, if we don't pass this wealth tax, then this will happen. If we do pass this wealth tax, then this will happen. Well, what if we pass it, but it doesn't happen? What if we don't pass it, but something else does happen? I mean, like, what's the argument for like the Republican budget? Right. If you look at the numbers and the reports going out, if I understand it right, it's saying that the tariffs will actually boost will result in business investments in America among Americans that will boost government revenue because the economy will explode in size. And this is right. This is sort of laughed at, as far as I understand, by most economists, saying no, that's not going to happen. You're actually shrinking the economy, and it's a total lie. But right, how do you actually disprove it? The assumptions the government is making about the effects that their laws will have are not right. They're assumptions. They haven't happened yet. And so there's always going to be someone who goes, oh, well, you can't actually prove that climate change is happening. It could just be a natural shift in Earth's environment. And well, yeah, I can't prove anything. Science can't prove anything. We know this. But it can make the likelihood, it can show us that the likelihood of this being false is so minute that we may as well just go outside and wait for the lightning to strike us. Instead of trying to live another day. And so, like, what do you do when in order to fix the budget deficit and the problems we have, you have to change many things. There's no easy fix. I'm over here arguing for a wealth tax, and sort of saying these ideas. I don't really like the viewpoint that this article has, but I'm also aware it's not a silver bullet. It's not a magic fix. There are problems with its activation, its use, and we're not entirely sure the effects it will have. But I would argue that it seems to me a reasonable part of a change we should make. At least based on the information I have and the things I've seen in my lifetime. But yeah, could you understand how that can happen, right? We're going to have a wealth tax, and right, it's much more difficult to say, okay, we're going to have this effect here, it's going to have this effect here, and probably in 20 years I'll be vindicated. Meanwhile, you end up, like, the more you fight with your enemy, the more you become like them, right? Your enemy is not going to be arguing there with scientific bits. They're going to be saying they want to raise taxes and wealth. They're going to be using slogans. They want to, it's a slippery slope. They're going to eventually use the same argument to raise taxes on you. They hate capitalism or whatnot. And so you reply to that with the slogan. What was I criticizing the Democrats for earlier, right? They were like, the Biden administration had a plan for raising taxes, and you read the plan. If I went online and read the plan, and it was like 2 pages of numbers and figures, and like I read each one, and like, okay, that kind of makes sense. That kind of makes sense. I don't know about this one. Don't know about this one. But this one makes sense. I agree with this one completely. I don't really think that sounds good. You go back and forth between them. And it did a few pages. And then there's like another report that was like 130 pages long or something attached to that explained the rationale for each of these. And to a great extent, it seems to me it was a failure of communication, right? The argument was, we're going to make these changes and it will have large long-term effects in the future. Like, we're being responsible, we're being scientific, we're being economic, we're trusting that the American populace understands our argument. And really the American populace turned out to go, I don't really get what you're talking about. What this other guy says is sounding real good. Or I understand that you're giving me a bunch of numbers and letters, but I also don't trust you because you've lied to me, or you represent someone who's lied to me before. Or I understand you have all this information about taxes and money, but you're also, for abortion, so you're evil. Therefore, nothing you say can ever be trusted. These sorts of views go through it, and like when I recall the arguments, it wasn't about who was going to be more effective. It was about a part of the reason I think that how do I put this? Recently, there has been a trend of Democrats fighting Republicans in the same way, name calling, essentially. And the reason this happens is because the enemy is using a tactic that seems to be effective, name calling, reducing complexity, resulting to slogans, making moral arguments instead of economic or scientific arguments. And they're winning. So what do? You copy them. But then what happens is you get involved in a race, and it becomes who makes the better slogans, who makes the better moral arguments, or the simpler moral arguments in many cases. So I do wonder if what the Democrats should do instead of this direct name calling and fighting on Twitter and whatnot. I see this in my feed on X sometimes. Breaking news, so and so said this. Breaking news, so and so replied on Twitter to this. I'm like, great. Like, Gavin Newsom is being tough online. I'm like, it's news. It pops up. It's a joke. It makes me not want to vote for the guy because he's playing their game instead of his own game. So I'm like, is there a different way? Right. For me, I'd ask, obviously the Harris campaign and the Biden campaign failed at communication, is what I appear. And so what do you do? Do you fix that method of communication, or do you abandon it entirely and move on to something else? We see the Democrats seem to have abandoned it entirely, moved on to something else. But I wonder if there's a way to do it more effectively. I suppose that's part of what I'm trying here, although the number of people who are sitting here and listening to me talk for an hour and meander around about subjects I barely understand is probably zero. It's mostly just me. Like, I'm talking to myself, trying to convince myself and learn about why I feel these ways about certain ideas. But I'm sure that some of my comments can be taken out of context. I'm sure there's a clip that could be made of something I said which sounds absolutely inane. All right, so this bit, any momentary jubilation would surely give way to incandescent rage once the government announced, say, reductions in disability benefits or a modest rise in the retirement age. That's the problem of using slogans, of using simple ideas. Like, you argue, I'm going to release the Epstein files, and then you don't. What you've done is you simplify the equation. You say, I will do this thing, the other person will not. Therefore, I'm good. But even the dumbest person who voted for you understands, oh, they didn't actually do it. What they said they were going to do, they didn't actually do. Or there was an investigation, the police investigated this, and they found them not guilty. What a surprise, right? And the police are like, well, we won't give you, like, the internal reasons for this, and we're not. Because it was an in-house issue, and we don't want you criticizing our methods. And you're going, okay, well, I didn't trust you in the first place, now I just don't trust you again. Just to give an example. How do you... That is, I think, something that also happens on the opposite side. If you're too open and you're too complicated, and you're giving all the minutia, it's like the... one of those courtroom dramas about like Johnny Depp's defamation trial. You hear about it for weeks and everyone has an opinion, and this bit of information pops with this bit and this bit. And if you actually want to understand what's going on, you gotta spend hours researching the whole issue because there's so many little tiny bits and pieces of information. And you get the sense that on a level of like politics, if I'm going in and I'm reading a 130-page or whatever, or 90-page, or however long it was, paper on why you're choosing to do taxes, the number of people who actually read that paper is incredibly small. Right? And you're going through and you're going, okay, my eyes are glazing over. I don't really understand what's going on here. And there's subtext, whatnot. So you end up relying upon a small group of people, like radio operators, the news, YouTubers, your local newspaper writer, to take these complex ideas and explain them simply. So what's the middle ground, right? How do you explain that, like, a wealth tax will have an effect in the future, but it also is not a silver bullet and you have to do these other things as well? So you have to suffer because I'm raising taxes on you, or you have to suffer because I'm cutting social spending. And it is also important to say, well, also the rich are suffering too. You're suffering and the rich is suffering. Everyone is suffering so that our children have a better life. You have to include that information. And you can't just say, we're going to raise taxes in order to pay for something. Who are these taxes being raised on? Because the feeling is that every individual area of the country is go, oh, they're raising taxes on me. They're raising taxes on the ultra-rich. I'm not going to use that to raise taxes on me. But you have to explain yourself why you do this. And the problem, the danger, is that a politician argues for this change. We're going to have social housing. We're going to do rent control, for example. And they argue it, and it's going to fix all our problems. And it turns out it doesn't fix all the problems. It fixes a few problems and creates other problems. Like any system. This is what any system, any law does. Right? The Constitution of the United States fixed some problems and created other issues. And so we went in and we modified it. We added amendments. Oh, it didn't talk about this. Or we're going to strike through this one that we did. We're going to fix something. Or this language isn't clear, so let us interpret it. And so on. I'm definitely in favor of something like a living constitution. It shouldn't be stuck in stone. Just because the founders had an idea of what this meant, and so it doesn't mean that we have to always follow that, right? You can always change it. You can always say the founders had this idea, but they didn't, the founders had this idea of guns, but they didn't have the concept of machines. They didn't have to deal with mass shootings in schools. The founders had this concept of fair taxes, but they also lived in an environment where landowners were the only people, who paid taxes. The founders lived in an environment where free speech was incredibly important, but free speech was also limited to one person or a newspaper article, and now you have someone tweeting about issues. The founders held the idea that Congress would never allow a president to take some of their duties, take the control of the purse. A president that got too strong would always be would always be attacked by Congress, because Congress wanted to keep its own power. But they didn't have to deal with an ineffective Congress that is split along party lines, that is unable to get much done at all. Right, so they're there's things that the president Donald Trump does today, with immigration enforcement and ICE and whatnot, which I'm absolutely sure that large parts of the Republican Party are for, but they also don't have the guts to actually vote for it, or the guts or the numbers to actually vote for it themselves, and actually say what they believe, to actually sound as radical. So they just stand by, let the radical do it for us. We're not responsible. It's him doing it. We're not responsible. It's the Democrats, stopping us from coming to a equitable agreement over the budget. That's this issue. It's not us. It's never us. And that just seems, that just pisses me off. But if you reduce it down to simple enough terms, we're going to fix the economy, and then you don't, anyone can see that. And so what happens is you get kicked out. And if you say, I'm going to pass a wealth tax that's going to, hurt us now, but be better for us in 20 years, what's going to happen is that the very next election, some guy is going to come up and says, you are suffering. I'm going to fix that suffering. And meanwhile, you're sitting here going, we are suffering for 18 years from now. Well, people have a very short memory, right? There's a very strong incentive to say, I'm suffering right now. We're going to fix the problems of right now. Don't worry about the problems of tomorrow, right? There's an entire change of mindset here. There's a very strong pressure to fix the problems of right now and ignore the problems of tomorrow. Very strong pressure. Incredibly strong pressure to pass a budget and ignore and hear about issues about the insolvency of Social Security and whatnot, but just pass it down. Someone else will do that. Someone else's problem, not mine. It's too complicated. If I do anything about it, I'm going to piss off a section of the population. I'm going to get kicked out of office. Right? You go back to what was it, Obamacare? There's a claim made by somebody, if we pass Obamacare, we're going to lose the Senate for the next 20 years, but we'll do it anyway because it's good. And I'm like, that's a politically speaking, an incredibly brave idea. We don't have a whole lot of those. It's really the sense you get. And why don't we have a whole lot of those? Partially, it's the American populace. A third of us don't vote. A third of us don't care. And of the 2/3 that do vote, at least 50-60% of those vote along party lines because they've always voted for that party, or they think the other party is bad. Like when you look at gerrymandered areas of the nation, when you look at the differences in the popular vote, and you realize that the entire thing comes down to a few 100,000 people in a few battleground states, then you start to really worry for the state of the nation. How on earth do we have a system that is so evenly split that 100,000 people decide the entire direction our country goes? Forget about the Electoral College and you can win 49% of the vote, but still end up with more electoral seats. I'm like, even if we ignore that, it seems so dangerous that you hear about we're losing. Someone they have Congress by 12 seats. They have the Senate by 2 seats, and so they can pass whatever they want because they have a majority of 2. Like, seriously, are our political parties so set in stone, so antagonistic to each other? Is this all the news you hear? You don't hear about them working together. You don't hear about a purple mixture. You hear about victory or defeat. You hear about the angel or the devil, depending on which side you're on. And partially it's short-term thinking, I feel. It's the history of the past taking over our thoughts of today, and us not looking towards the future. Us not asking, what is life going to be when I retire in 30 or 40 years? And to a large extent, this probably has to do with the way our system works, in that who is the most politically active percentage of the population? The young and the old. Why? Because they have the time. Hey, if you're 65, you're retired, you have time to get into politics. You have time to vote, you have time to decide, you have time to look up what's going on. If you are young and in college, you have time to get into politics, to sit on the grass on the university quad and talk to people about what's going on. Then you go to work at 24, 25, and you work and you work and you work, and you're just busy, and you're trying to make it through the very next day. And I don't really care about that we're going to pass taxes that I have to suffer for now. It'll be better for me in 20 years. I'm just focused on getting through today. I don't want to lose my house. You don't have the time. Eventually you do when you're 65, but by then that time to do things for the betterment of the nation has passed. Now it's I'm old and I'm tired, and I want to ensure my wealth grows. I want to ensure that my house value doesn't go down. I want to ensure that my healthcare stays. And I want to ensure that these young radicals in the colleges don't, destroy my culture. Eventually, the young radicals become the new elders. And there are a few changes, but I don't know, maybe it's a question, right? Reductions in disability benefits or a modest rise in the retirement age. There have been riots in France over raising the retirement age. And we know that the system, the economic system we have, does not work. We know that the governments are going into massive debt in order to fund retirement and healthcare for their population. And that either you need to raise taxes, you need to lower payments, or you need to raise the retirement age so that you don't pay out as much. And you have to balance the budget. And that's the heart of the issue, right? A country at some point in its lifetime has to balance the budget. At some point, you have enough riches that you need to spend them on something to take your economy, or you have enough debt you can't afford to take on any new debt. And you have to balance income and outcome. Or you do something crazy, right? Like go to war in order to fix all your problems. As an individual, I'm like, yeah, sure. Raise the retirement age to 68. Fine. I'm retiring at 65, retiring at 68. What does it matter to me? But when I'm 52, but when I'm 63, it'd probably matter a whole lot more. Where are where are the counter demonstrations? Where's the group who are saying raise the retirement age? Because I want the state to be fiscally viable when my retirement comes. It's a whole lot harder to argue for. It's a whole lot harder to get your time off work to do. It's a whole lot harder to drag yourself out of bed to go visit the local council and make a statement. momentary jubilation. If you make a tough choice that says we suffer now in order to be better tomorrow, then you are taking a risk. There's always going to be a group who says, I don't want to suffer today. I don't care about tomorrow. I don't want to suffer today. And they're going to try to get you out. So in order to remain in, you need people who are willing to suffer today in order for tomorrow. You need people who are, to use the phrase from that speech a while ago, willing to make the hard choice instead of the easy one. And it's not that that's rare, I think. It's that we can make the easy choice sound obvious and the hard choice sound dumb. Okay, then it says, third, nativity. Mr. Zuckman's newfound supporters underestimate the risks of letting the wealth tax out of the bag. Many wealth tax advocates almost certainly see a levy of 2% as just the start. Mr. Zuckman seemed to favor a tax of 8%. And this is partially why I'm talking about this, because they quote here, they say, and observe Thomas Piketty, Mr. Zuckman's mentor, who has gone in the past decade from advocating mild wealth taxes to the ones that would confiscate 90% of the biggest fortunes. Mr. Piketty recently floated the possibility that rich folk who tried to leave France to avoid the tax should be arrested at the airport. I'm like, okay, that's interesting to hear, because the book I read on taxes in the capital in the 21st century was arguing for very modest wealth taxes. And it's saying that now he's become much more radical, the author has, Thomas Piketty. I'm going, okay, so that means that he's been pushing for this, he's been fighting for this, he's been arguing for wealth taxes, and it hasn't been successful. Right? That's what that suggests to me, that he becomes more radical over time, the more he fights for it. The more people cascade him for his ideas, he doubles down and doubles down and doubles down. And I think this is what happens also with any political movement. Right? Shoot, I'm doing this. I can see myself doing this as I give these talks about wealth and disparity and taxes. That an idea which was before kind of, I don't know about this. Now I'm going, well, actually, I seem to be in support of this as I argue with myself and talk more. Good ideas seem to be more good. Bad ideas seem to be more bad. When you hear the same argument again and again and again, you grow tired of it. You're like, okay, I'm just going to, instead of spending 3 hours arguing back and forth about what a wealth tax does or not, I'm just going to say, nope, you're wrong, because I've had this argument already. With myself, at least, because I've read the book already, right? And I don't need to hash through every single argument you're going to make. I've defeated all of them. I disagree with every single one, and this is why. Or I agree with one or two here, but I don't think they overcome these issues, and this is the response I've raised. I hear this politician talk about the idea, but I don't agree with everything he says. But eventually, you somehow, right, begin to be like support them, and you're like, okay, how do I have a nuanced view? It's like if you're end up saying, if you end up supporting Donald Trump, and you're like, well, I don't really like some of his, I don't really like him or these ideas or those ideas. He's got a few good points here, and you're like, well, so I support him, and then as you argue with people, as you talk back and forth, you find out that there's two sides. You can support him, or you can not support him. You can either support him totally, or you can think of him as the devil. And of course, the reality is a more nuanced view. But it's very hard to hold a nuanced view, especially in a political system like that in America, where you choose red or blue. You choose one or the other. You can vote green. You can vote libertarian. Good luck getting on the ballot. Good luck winning a national election. Maybe you can vote for an independent. maybe one Green candidate might get on the state Senate. This is a problem. That over time, as we continue these arguments, especially like I said that I've heard about the arguments about housing for 30 years. I've heard the arguments about insolvency and Social Security. I've heard the arguments against national health care over and over and over again, and eventually you end up taking shortcuts. I've heard about racism over and over again, for example, and eventually there's the depth of anything you say. Like the depth of information in every word that you're trying to communicate is involved in this giant historical drama. And you're trying to have your own ideas, but it requires so much time and energy and effort. Much, much easier to just say, I'm against racism, than to critique the 17 different colors and these different views and Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King and modern anti-racism versus anti-racism in the 60s. And, well, we should be nonviolent like Gandhi. Well, no. Well, Gandhi advocated, these effects which don't seem like modern anti-violence. Or, part of the reason that the British government worked with Gandhi is because you had a rising level of very violent people, of another rebellion that Gandhi was kind of holding back, and so they were showing progress in this way instead of having to throw a bunch of troops into India and fight another rebellion. They were probably not going to win. Much, much easier to we'll work with Gandhi and we'll negotiate some favorable economic exchanges. Right? And you go, well, maybe Gandhi's anti-violence worked because of the threat of violence if they didn't go with anti-violence. And well, anti-violence works in some cases, but, if the enemy is willing to just genocide your entire population, anti-violence ain't going to do a damn thing. Issues like that. Okay, so to go back, right? It's a slippery slope argument. If you have a wealth tax on the ultra-rich, then one day you'll have a wealth tax on the rich. And one day you'll have a wealth tax on the middle class. And one day you'll have a wealth tax on the poor. And one day we'll all be communist. We'll all be socialist. Everyone will be equal. Right? Isn't that where it ends up? And like all slippery slope arguments, the flaw is that it can be applied to anything. Oh my God, you're putting tariffs on America, on goods coming into America? Well, I mean, these tariffs they're going to go up 20%, 30%, 50%, 100%, 200%. You're going to abolish slavery? Well, that will destroy our entire Southern economy down to the bone. It will destroy our way of life. It will destroy everything. I'm like, no. The South survived just fine. Southern culture survived just fine. It was all blown out of proportion, right? You can go, oh my gosh, the Republicans are going to get in office and they're going to destroy America. Oh my gosh, the Democrats are going to get in office and they're going to destroy America. Well, yeah, they might, or they might not. Anything can happen from anything else. If anybody has even one nuke, if one country has a nuke, then the other country is going to go, we have to have a nuke. And then they're going to go, oh my gosh, we need 2 nukes. We need 3 nukes. We need 4 nukes. All of a sudden, everybody has 500,000 nukes. You go, this country gets a nuke, they're going to use it. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But you can make a slippery slope argument for any tax, especially. You're going to have an income tax. Well, eventually you're going to tax everybody's income. Yeah, but that decision has to be made. It's passed into law. It's argued through a system. And then in that system, you have political voices arguing in the other direction. You could just as well say that when they reduce the income tax, so eventually what they're going to do is they're going to remove the income tax entirely. and they're trying to cut government spending. So eventually, what they're going to cut government spending, then cut it, then cut it, then cut it, and then they're going to get to defense spending. They're going to cut that. Then they're going to cut Social Security. Then they're going to cut Medicare, and then they're going to gut the entire system. And we're going to end up back like the Confederation with a government that can't do anything because they want to destroy the government. I'm like, yeah, maybe it ends up that way, but maybe it doesn't. There's always a pushback. The end of the world is not here in one moment. The end of the world happens slowly, and there's plenty of time to fight back against it. Okay. Now, finally, one of the important bits is in the book, Capital in the 21st Century, what Piketty sort of argues, I think, is that we have this rising level of income disparity that will cause social issues. And in order to stop these social issues from happening, we need to reduce income disparity. Wealth taxes are the most effective means of reducing income disparity. So let us pass wealth taxes. And if you say, well, wealth tax doesn't make any sense, then you still have to deal with the original argument. Income disparity is happening. So how do you deal with that? Because you can either say income disparity is not a problem, or you say we deal with income disparity in a different way. So instead of a wealth tax, let's do this. And they have some suggestions at the very end here, right? France has other options if it wants to right the fiscal ship. And if the government of France doesn't have any money, so a wealth tax won't raise any money. Let's not do it. Instead, we will have higher rates of VAT, as well as taxes on land and other immovable property would raise plenty of money. A carbon tax would make a difference too. And at some point, this country will have to raise its absurdly low retirement age. So higher rates of VAT, corporate tax, business tax, consumer tax. It doesn't hurt the rich capitalist. It hurts the people who buy things. It hurts the company itself, right? It doesn't tax wealth directly. It taxes income. Taxes on land and other immovable property. Yeah, raise taxes on land, but you have a problem there, right? If you raise taxes on land, then either you do it equitably, or inequitably, right? Either you say, okay, all the land taxes are going up by 15%. Or you say land taxes in this area are going up by 15%. Okay? And if you raise all land taxes by 15%, then you end up squeezing individual landowners, individual homeowners, individual small business owners just as much as the big. And this is an equal level tax, but it doesn't help income disparity in any way whatsoever. And in fact, it may be effectively regressive and reduce and increase income disparity as larger people with larger amounts of wealth can pay that tax because they receive greater returns versus someone with a smaller level of wealth who doesn't receive the greater returns. As the book Capital in the 21st Century points out, that you get larger returns with larger initial capital. Taxes on land and other movable property. Right? Okay, and so if you raise taxes on land in only certain areas, then this is effectively a wealth tax. It's saying you own land in the city. You own land which is worth a lot of money. So we're going to raise taxes on you. Well, then why not just have a bloody wealth tax? That is a wealth tax. In the argument for not having a wealth tax, they're arguing for a wealth tax. Or they're arguing for an average tax which is regressive. And that doesn't make any sense to me. A carbon tax would make a difference too. Again, this is a consumer and business tax. This taxes companies. This doesn't tax people directly. Why would you do that? Why would you have an indirect tax like that when you can have a direct tax? on high levels of wealth. Right? The point I think they're arguing here is that they're looking at this through a state level. The state does not have enough money. How does the state raise money? Well, it can raise taxes here and here and here, but not a wealth tax. Instead, these taxes on companies, essentially, and companies and individuals. But it's going to be companies, I would imagine, right? Because as far as I'm aware, the wealth of the highest level of individuals is in the companies they own. So that you, like, an individual doesn't own the land Sears Tower is on. It's a company that owns it. It's some trust, right? It's some agglomeration. It's some agreement that's been made. Individuals don't own that. So don't own that directly. It's through some sort of corporate structure. Generally speaking, is how I understand it. Okay, then a carbon tax would make a difference too. Yeah, because that says that a carbon tax is essentially something like the car companies are producing these. A power plant is burning coal, which releases toxins into the air, which affects the citizens of the country and increases healthcare costs. So we're going to tax the company who is burning coal in order to help pay for the healthcare problems that they caused or that they contributed to. The government says we have to deal with changing climate. The fields. I read a report a while ago. It was about the wine fields of France are changing. The wine producing areas of France, people have to move out of them. People have to move into different areas of the country and start raising wines there, raising grapes there because of climate change. And the government wants to help this. The government wants to protect its national industry and whatnot. The government does soil studies. And it's very difficult for, hey, say you are in France and you make wine and you have grapes and you're suffering because of climate change. What are you going to do? Sue every coal producing company on the planet and say, I want 3 cents from each of you. We're going to go to court to get it from you. Good luck with that. But a company, a country, I should stop talking. I'm stumbling over my words now. A country can have a general carbon tax and say, okay, we're going to take this money, we're going to use it to help people who have suffered because of climate change. We're going to use it to put sea walls around areas of the country that are suffering from rising sea levels, or we're going to use it to increase the levels of our water reserves to deal with variability in rainfall, issues like that. But a carbon tax is, at the end of the day, a tax on companies, a tax on commerce. It makes it more expensive to do production of one sort or another. It makes it more expensive to buy things. It is a tax on the general economy of the country. It is an indirect tax, as I would say it. And these are dangerous. A direct tax is much more valuable, much more viable, I would say. Perhaps you could raise corporate taxes on this. But again, you could just raise taxes on individuals who own those corporations. Like, I don't really understand. Like, it seems to me that what they're arguing for is France needs to raise money, so it should tax everyone except the rich. France needs to raise money, so it should tax its businesses. It should tax its individuals who buy things. And who buys things? Not the rich. The rich invest. It's the poor person who goes to the supermarket, who buys gas, who gets a bicycle, who has to repair his roof. They're the ones who buy things all the time. At a certain level of wealth, you take your $100,000 and you take your $200,000 a year in income, and everything else you just invest. You grow like that. It's. But when you're making 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, then 100,000 each year, and you're improving your lifetime, improving your quality of life, I would think. Or at least this is how I generally understand it to be, right? That in quality of life improves very rapidly when you move from low to middle levels of income. But quality of life begins to grow more slowly as you move from middle to high and ultra high levels of income. Taxes on land and other immovable property. Tax stock. This is property. Tax diamonds and jewels and artwork. That is property. It says immovable property. Because it's easier. Because, oh my gosh, the rich might leave. And I guess my real question is, so the rich leave. How does that affect me?